and sending a message to the nation.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Dan Clark. The state legislature returned to Albany this week to pass another round of bills they missed out on because of the coronavirus. Lawmakers cut sessions short this year when the pandemic started in March. They've been back a few times for various reasons, but have largely stayed away from the state capitol. Governor Andrew Cuomo, meanwhile, flew down to Georgia to lend a hand in that state's response to COVID-19, and he used the trip to criticize the federal government.
I think this has gone on much longer than it should have because of our politics, because of our division, because the federal government is in denial, and because of their incompetence.
That's, of course, not a new position for Cuomo. With me in studio to discuss that and more is Karen DeWitt from New York State Public Radio. Karen, thanks for being here.
It's my first time in the studio in 5 months.
It's the first time of anybody being in studio in 5 months.
So it's a debut. It's been a while, huh?
I know. So let's talk about the governor.
Yes.
He went down to Georgia this week to help that state with its COVID-19 aid. He's also on a rampage right now against the federal government, saying this has only gone on so long because the federal government hasn't taken similar actions as the state. And of course, he's calling on a federal executive order for mask wearing. Is that right?
I don't think that you can argue that the federal leadership has not been good, that there's been mixed messages about should businesses open, reopen, should schools be closed, should they be forced to reopen even if some of them don't think it's safe. Very mixed messages on masks, with the president not being a fan of masks, to say the least. Until recently, he's kind of saying, yes, it's necessary in some cases. And if you look at what New York's done with the virus, we're more in line with the European countries, South Korea, Australia, who have, you know, fingers crossed, conquered the virus for now. And the rest of the country that didn't do all, you know, following the science like New York did, Florida, Texas, even California, they're in really big trouble right now. So I think Governor Cuomo, while maybe he says it too many times, like every day he talks about the feds, I mean, he's not wrong about it right now. Of course, we're not going to know till the pandemic's over someday, like who's right and who's wrong. But right now, it seems like New York, the European countries have done it the right way so far.
And the legislature was back in Albany this week, and they didn't act on any COVID-19 related bills because, as you said, and as our audience knows, the numbers in New York are down significantly. We're less than 700 or less than 800 hospitalizations, about 10 deaths every day, somewhere around there. So we're doing well. What bills did you notice that they passed this week? Was there anything huge that you had? I have a few here, but I'm curious to see what you were watching.
Yeah, please read them, because I was struggling to find any that, you know, rose to the level of reporting on, you know, while all this other stuff is going on.
There's like a few. What I noticed is they had some voting reforms that they passed, allowing expanded absentee ballot voting for the general election, like how they did in the primary, moved up the voter registration deadline to 10 days before an election instead of 25. There's also the Protect Our Courts Act, which I think was probably, from my perspective, be the biggest bill that they passed, which bars ICE arrests around state courthouses. And then they
that was a big one.
Yeah, they did a moratorium on facial recognition technology in schools as well, which I think was targeted in Niagara County, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah, Lockport City Schools, right.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier this week, and I think the bigger story here is what they were not doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, they never did their official end of session, so it's a lot of cleanup, a lot of tweaking bills. One that I noticed is they closed a loophole on fracking. Hydrofracking is banned in New York, but you could still dump hydrofracking waste. So that's significant. But in terms of, you know, what's going on with the pandemic, it's, you know, it's definitely under the radar screen. But they had to finish their session work at some point, and that's the big question: are they going to come back or not to deal with some big elephants in the room, like the state budget deficit?
Right, that's the big thing. We're facing more than $13 billion in lost revenue because of the coronavirus. There's a huge deficit coming up. I mean, that's something that we haven't seen in years here, not since I think the governor took office. It was around that level.
Yeah, it was about $10 billion when he took office, so it's been a really long time since we've seen that. Yeah, and as for reasons that we'll get into later in the show, they're hesitating on dealing with those big items that they're facing.
Yeah, like let's talk about marijuana legalization. That's a
Well,
thought.
I haven't heard anything about that.
Yeah, exactly. In
Yeah.
March, in March, it was like a thought of, well, we could raise some revenue through marijuana legalization. Of course, we wouldn't realize it in a few years, but at least that would be there down the line. This week, there wasn't even a mention of it. It just seemed like they were coming back, and I think you're right, to just clean things up and leave, and if they have to come back to deal with the budget, they will.
Yeah, and in a way, like Governor Cuomo would just take the lead on all of this stuff and the
Yeah.
blame or the credit for what goes wrong, what goes right.
Right, right. The emergency powers that he has don't expire until April. And the Democrats, as we'll hear, you interviewed Andrea Stewart-Cousins, the Senate Majority Leader. She says that he's really used the powers well, and she says the voters think that he used the powers well. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. Cuomo also ruffled some more feathers this week. Last Friday, I think he put it down initially, but restaurants and bars now can't serve alcohol without food. And then there's all this confusion of, can I sell a side of chips with a drink, or does it have to be a full meal? I mean,
That seems like that's all that anybody's talking about.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's because people want to get out. They're just tired of being shut up inside, and the virus is low here. I think people don't see the threat as much as they did, and it is very confusing. How do you regulate that? The governor says he never was never allowed outdoor drinking, but that wasn't clear when he did, you know, ease the rules. And we went
really
into.
don't think that's true.
Yeah.
I think they did allow outside drinking.
They didn't specifically say no. That's,
Yeah, I
that's
think
my
that's the
recollection.
thing.
When it was phase 2 or phase 3 and it reopened, it was more,
Yeah.
you know, outdoor dining. And you would think that would mean you could go up to the bar, but then apparently it's got out of hand because too many people went up to the bar and they started congregating. You know, you have a couple of drinks and you just kind of forget about all those pesky rules, you know?
And I know people that work at bars here in Albany, and I asked them several times, like, are you sure that you can reopen? And they're like, yeah, we have guidance and everything.
Yeah.
Before I have to let you go, because we have your interview with Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins, give me the key takeaways that you had from that interview before we take a look.
Well, you know, I think as always, she's very poised. She's really a good leader for the Senate, and but I think that she's also pretty careful about what she says in terms of, you know, she knows that she's got to guide this, and right now she's you know, also walking through, you know, some pretty tight waters.
Yeah, you guys talk about a lot of things. Let's take a look at that interview.